Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, Chief Storymaker and your host of this podcast. We share stories for many reasons. We want to persuade, we want to entertain, and we want to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're sharing them with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into lessons from each of those stories. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? Well, when I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, but not to respond necessarily. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories, and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's podcast theme is slowing down time. Many years ago, I read a post by Nilofer Merchant about what she calls the in-between space. She describes it as summers when you were young were the in-between spaces of learning, where you could languish in playtime and no learning time was ahead. That time where you got a job offer but hadn't started yet, maybe even during the search for a new role. Perhaps it's as simple as when you're clear of a new direction. I think of that post often. I kind of live in the in-between space. It's a weird sort of comfort zone for me. I rarely stay content in a job, place, or project. There has to be consistent growth and change in pretty much everything I do. And while it's not uncommon to find people like me, I believe for the majority of people, that equation, comfort equals happiness, is true. It was in a recent conversation that I realized this about myself, that I'm in a constant state of change and churn, and that I sometimes let that get me anxious and stressed. It's silly, because I know I bring it on myself. I could say no. I could turn down opportunities to sing, to speak, to mentor, but I love it. I love the feeling of change and growth, and none of my choices or activities are things that I don't want to do. Anything that feels like obligation makes me feel prickly, so I know when I choose to do something, it's my choice. In one eye-opening conversation as I was sharing my upcoming schedule with someone, I said, "Oh, thank goodness, I don't have anything coming up in the next few days to stress me out." Her response was exactly what I needed to hear. "Did you hear what you just said? I mean, I know you're excited about your performances coming up, but the way you said that made it sound like you were totally stressed out, like maybe you should have said no." She was right. I was telling myself that the upcoming things I love to do were stressful. Yes, preparing for something like a live performance takes time, but is that stressful or is it just scheduling? The reality is that whether it's good stress or bad stress, it has the same negative effect on your body and your brain. And that's why it's so important not only to find ways to decompress, but also to choose to be present in what we do. My next aha moment came when someone mentioned an annual event where I would be singing. It was in April, and I didn't want to talk about it at that point in early February. I realized I had a lot of great things coming up before that April performance, and I didn't want to rush. That's when Nilofer's post came back to me again. I was in that in-between space, with the conference coming up in late February, a few other exciting events that were scheduled over the following months, and yes, that performance coming up in April. But I didn't want to talk about it because that would make it happen too fast. I wasn't in a hurry. When planning our wedding 20 years ago, I kept a journal with photos taped inside to document the details of the planning process. I knew that by embracing and enjoying each part of the journey, I would slow down the time before the actual wedding day. I also figured that this strategy would help with the emotional letdown following a big event. People talk about what a blur their weddings were, that they don't feel like they really had a chance to enjoy it. And that strategy, the journal, the photos, it worked for me. And now I recommend it to others planning their weddings. It's almost like slowing down time. It's not easy to be present every day and every moment. And if we want to slow down time and enjoy this wild adventure, we have to decompress periodically and be intentional about how we choose to spend our time. That concept of the in-between space is an important one because it reminds us that living for the weekend or an upcoming vacation or the next promotion or raise leaves us without time to enjoy the little things, those small joys in just, well, being. Being near people we love, being in nature, being in a place to create and build and grow something, being quiet. To slow down time, we need to stop thinking of each day as stressful, trying to make something happen, and start thinking about each day as an opportunity to enjoy the journey. Even in the most beautiful environments, decompressing and finding your way back to being present doesn't always come quickly or easily. A few years ago, when I realized this concept of in-between space and slowing down time, I asked my husband to plan a backpacking trip. I had always wanted to try packing into the wilderness, like many of our friends do, and I thought that if there was a way to slow down time, I'd find it by disconnecting from devices and reconnecting with myself and in nature. We took our time getting out of town, knowing it would be light well into the evening, and not wanting to get started on our hike while it was still over 80 degrees outside. I had never backpacked into the wilderness for overnight camping, though I had spent plenty of time hiking through mountains. Gear is important for trekking into bear country, so we made sure we had a can of bear spray, a loud whistle, good shoes for hiking, crossing streams, and a water pump so we wouldn't have to carry too much water. It was about 5:30 in the evening when we left the car with our packs on our backs and started hiking into the Scapegoat Wilderness area in Montana. It was a well-worn trail, lots of horses and hikers exploring the area, and many take the 3-mile hike in, even just for a day trip, to visit the famously beautiful Devil's Glen section of the Dearborn River. It wasn't too rigorous a hike for my first trip in with a heavy pack, and although my pack looked almost as big as I am, it was only around 30 pounds. It didn't seem like very long before we hit the 3-mile mark and saw a handful of tents and campers around fires in the meadow above the Devil's Glen, and we decided to keep hiking and see if we could find a more secluded spot near the river. Another 3/4 of a mile, and we headed down a less worn path toward the river. Bob spotted a perfect campsite on the other side, so we crossed carefully, found a place to pitch the tent, and settled in for 2 nights. The river was loud and full of life, and as we watched the sunset, we saw trout splashing in a large pool on the opposite side of the river. We heard grasshoppers, birds, and the droning sound of insects. After a simple dinner of freeze-dried convenience with decent flavor, we shared a sip of bourbon from the flask and sat by the river to enjoy the view. My head was clear for a moment, taking in that spectacular pink and orange across the sky. When we climbed into our little tent and put our heads down on makeshift pillows of clothes, I thought I'd fall right to sleep because I was exhausted. The temperature was perfect. The air was clean and fresh, slight breeze through the tent. As my eyes were closing, I became super aware of the sounds of the night around me, and I remembered that I was in bear country. It took me hours to fall asleep, jolting awake after incorporating the sound of something outside into my dream and thinking it was a bear outside the tent. Eventually, I fell into a deep sleep and was disappointed to wake up to the early morning light coming into the tent. My head was filled. I fell into a deep sleep and was disappointed to wake up to the early morning light coming into the tent, my head full of busyness. I thought that within a few hours of being in the wild mountains of Montana, my head would be clear of my everyday activities, but it wasn't. Despite spending hours wandering through the spectacular wilderness, my mind was still stuck in overdrive. I woke as I always wake at home, with my head full of thoughts about what would come next. What did I forget to do at work? Excitement for our next musical performance, upcoming travel plans, and thoughts of what our boys might be doing at that moment by themselves at the house. Why couldn't I clear my head? I closed my eyes, trying hard to think of nothingness, to listen intently to the sounds around me, to smell the air and nearby wildflowers. It must have been more than 20 minutes that I tried to relax back into my sleeping bag, getting more and more frustrated with my inability to simply be there, enjoying that peaceful environment. I finally turned to Bob, who was also struggling to sleep, and suggested we get up, get the food bag from the tree, and make coffee. I've been here before. Many years ago, I was on a yoga pad at the end of a class, trying to get into the ending meditation provided by the instructor. I was filled with frustration. Every time I tried to focus and drop myself into that meditation, I'd find my mind wandering all over the place, flitting from one topic to the next. And that was the moment, after about 10 years of trying yoga, I realized I didn't really like it. That first morning in the woods, focusing on action helped. I was hungry and immediately set off to pump some water for our coffee. I never would have thought flies, especially the biting kind, would be a welcome distraction, but there I was, swiping at the flies landing on my legs and starting up the little burner for the coffee. No thoughts buzzing in my head but the need for coffee and oatmeal. We packed up for a day hike and headed upstream, bushwhacking through the dense, lush forest among wild roses, Indian paintbrush, elk scat, mushrooms, and dead trees littering the ground. Stopping along the rushing river periodically for Bob to cast his nymph, hoping for a brown trout for dinner, I had the camera poised for my own catch for the weekend. It was mostly quiet, which in bear country isn't really a good thing, so I hummed and sang some of the songs that we were working on for our next gig. My head wasn't clear, but I was relaxed. By the time we hiked back out to the car after 2 nights, I was tired but not exhausted. I felt strong, healthy, and comfortable in my skin, even though I probably smelled like I hadn't bathed in a few days. I unloaded my backpack into the car, opened the cooler we had stashed inside, and pulled out my favorite local brew, Lewis & Clark Brewery's Prickly Pear Pale Ale. My head was finally clear. Driving back through some of the most beautiful landscapes in the country, I turned on my phone to let our boys know we were on our way and to suggest they clean up evidence of junk food binging. It beeped and beeped as the signal came, and it retrieved all those missed calls and text messages. I wanted to ignore it, but the pull of connection was too strong. I read the messages. I really didn't miss anything. So I put the phone down and didn't pick it up again until we unloaded the car back at our house. I had no intention of looking at my computer when I got home and managed to leave it closed until late into the evening when I had to review a document for a deadline. It took me 3 days to disconnect from my devices and clear my head, and I realized that can't be a good thing. A lot has been written about humanity's disconnect from nature as a result of our addiction to our electronic devices, and that disconnect has wreaked havoc on our ability to spend time safely out in nature and effectively connect with the people around us. And if we don't disconnect from screens and reconnect with people, ourselves, and our natural environment, and find ways to embrace that in-between space, we'll lose our ability to connect in any real way with our own humanity. What will you do to change this trajectory in your life and the lives of your family? How will you adjust your patterns to slow down time? Because if you don't, you'll miss out on all kinds of stories to share. So enjoy that in-between. Make yourself some stories. Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me